and trade them. And so no one's saying it's not going to be regulated. In fact, it's the opposite, which is as it's regulated, it's the green light for traditional money and institutional money to enter the asset class.
Just a little follow-up.
What about this before James? Before you follow up, James, one last quick comment, Michael, and then I'll give it over to James. What about the other risk of governments starting to see it as big enough of a threat that they work to crushing it?
Well, I mean, that was the question people had in 2013. I mean, in fact, I thought that in 2013. I tweeted about it. If the government was going to crush it, like the IRS, doesn't designate stolen property or counterfeit money as property, right? If you're counterfeiting stuff, the IRS wouldn't give you a designation of property. So we lurched towards something clearly being legitimized in 2014, and then between 2014 and 2020, it was a question mark. But then in 2018 or so, you started seeing options on transactions without any AML KYC at any size. Now you're crossing over banking regulations and currency regulations, right? And that's highly controversial. But what's not controversial is whether institutions and individuals and corporations in the Western world can own property. So it's been acknowledged, like Berkshire Hathaway can own billions of dollars of Apple stock, right? Warren Buffett's not going to wire $1 billion of Apple stock to Africa without acknowledging that transaction publicly. So the use of Apple stock as currency would be controversial, but the use of Apple stock as property or capital, not so controversial. And so when you think of Bitcoin as, I own a building, right? Am I allowed to own a building? Well, the truth is you can own a building in China as well as in the United States or Europe. You know where you can't own a building? Cuba or North Korea. So where it's illegal to own property, then Bitcoin is in a regulatory
20x for BlackRock. But ultimately the question is they take custody. Could there be a swap similar to 1933?
Yeah, sometimes people think that, but what they're missing is in 1933, the US dollar was pegged to gold, right? It was $20 per ounce. And so the US dollar is not pegged to commercial real estate in New York City. And the US dollar is not pegged to Apple stock. And the US dollar is not pegged to Bitcoin. And the US dollar is not pegged to the value of your sports team. So if the US dollar was pegged to something, then of course it becomes very political. And what happened after that act was the US devalued the dollar from $20 to an ounce to $34 to an ounce. So that was all about getting off the gold standard. Right? There is no Bitcoin standard. So the time for you to worry is 50 years from now, when all the money in the world is Bitcoin, when Bitcoin is $450 trillion worth of Apple stock to somebody in Africa, and you don't want to talk about who you sent it to, right? Right. But those are problems that people that have $900 trillion worth of assets have today already. We're not going to change the politics or the geopolitics of the world here. What we're doing is giving people a better investment than Google. That's the point.
Yeah, I get it.
Michael, let me ask you a question. You'll probably like it less than the previous questions, to be honest. And something that James touched on very briefly. For the audience that's already convinced of Bitcoin and crypto in general, I want to ask about ETH. But before doing that, I want to go to something that James mentioned, and that's meme coins sucking up a lot of that liquidity away from potentially Bitcoin, Ethereum, and assets that many investors see that they feel like they've missed out on. I want to get your take on two things. First, the impact meme coins have had on Bitcoin and crypto in general, from an optics perspective, and from a perspective of
fine. And so sometimes, some places you're allowed to do it, other places you're not allowed to do it. It would take a lot more than a few minutes to cover all the nuances of it. I think that you have to think very carefully about what kind of investor are you and what kind of investment are you making.
Yep. Hey,
and you've just on the ETH, on the ETH. I'm sorry, James. Just on the ETH question as well. I've asked pretty directly whether your MicroStrategy could ever have ETH on your balance sheet. And again, I want to reference another quote that you've used to describe ETH. You said ETH is more akin to a platform trying to dematerialize the JP Morgan building and the banking establishment. You've called Bitcoin as the foundational granite block for that building.
Yeah, right now what's clear is that there's regulatory support for public companies and institutions to hold Bitcoin. There isn't right? We're 150% Bitcoin. We're going to be Bitcoin. And the only thing I like more than Bitcoin is more Bitcoin.
That's a great answer, Michael. Hey, when we were in Nashville at the biggest Bitcoin conference in the world, both RFK and Trump, I don't know if it was hype. I'd love to hear your opinion on it. But they talked about the US government accumulating Bitcoin, outside of regulatory seizures. One, do you take that seriously? And two, what would the effect to, our national debt, the state of our, budget? Have you thought about that at all since those announcements?
Well, I think what's clear here is the Overton window is shifting. 4 years ago, the question was, is the government going to ban Bitcoin? And 4 years go by, and now the discussion is how. And so the competitor to holding bonds as the global capital asset is Bitcoin. So the smartest thing you could do to support the US dollar is simply buy 20% of the thing that everybody might one day switch to before they get there. It's kind of like the US buying Louisiana territory or buying Alaska, or just, if you have Virginia and the Eastern colonies, you might as well get the rest of the nation, because if people go west, wouldn't you want to own the place they're going to go to? That was generally the idea, so Bitcoin represents the next financial frontier. You ought to buy it because it's a smart investment, but you should also just buy it because if people lose faith in all your other instruments, that's where they're going to go, and you might as well be there. The results range from good to great, right? I think that there's a lot of other questions that'll be decided November 5th where there are good and bad outcomes, but because it's a very complicated situation. But I think with Bitcoin, time is on our side. I think that Bitcoin is again, it's a new digital capital asset. And after November